Hello, Kaylin, and who else is with us so far? Kaylin, looks like it's just you and I. Can you see me and hear me, Kaylin?
I can, and my name is pronounced Callan.
Callan, all right. Thanks for helping me get the accent on the right syllable. Callan. Yep. I like that name. I've never heard a name like that. I like it. Callan.
Yeah, it's pretty unique. Never heard it anywhere.
Well, hey, it's 12:30. I said we'd start at 12:30, but I'm going to let a few other folks get the opportunity to chime in because I'm sure we're having technical difficulties just doing the first few weeks of just figuring all this stuff out. So how's the first week for you? Are you feeling a little more settled in given all the craziness?
I do feel a little more settled in this
good.
time. Yeah.
Good. And what brought you to this class? I'm just curious.
One of the things I taking high school and college classes at the same time. Mm-hmm. So, and I wanted to know more about history. So,
good. Well, you've come to the right place.
Yeah.
Good. Let me just see. I can't find it. All right. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So do you have any questions so far with just classroom logistics? Because I did this last week. I discussed this last week, and I want to spend today, I want to actually spend today going over some course material.
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Hello, Kayla. Thanks for joining. We can see you but can't hear you, Kayla. Welcome. Hello, Kayla, and hello, Joey. Hello.
Hello.
Kayla, can you see me? You can always also use these little reactions here if you want. Yay. Yay. Okay. So unless any of you have any logistical questions right now, and if you do have logistical questions, tomorrow's Zoom afternoon meeting, the one that starts at 5, are more for the office hour type of logistical issues, or you can call me or we'll set up a one-on-one Zoom thing if you just want to have like a one-on-one office hour or even a telephone call. I'm so happy about that. But what I want to do for the next little over an hour is just to present you with material and me. I'll kind of pretend this is a lecture hall and I'll be looking around all over the place and just sharing some stories with you. Does that sound good? That sound good? All right, Kayla, Callan, you got a thumbs up or anything, Callan? That sound good? Okay, I like it. So let me begin. And Callan, were you actually able to hear the Bob Marley song Buffalo Soldier when you first arrived? I just want to make sure all the technologies work.
I heard some of it.
Okay, great. All right, well, let us begin. Oops. So as those of you who have already started on assignment 1, part 1, I'm going to be uploading this live lecture, but I'm also going to be posting a series of shorter lectures that's connected to each of the answers. And today's live lecture is an opportunity for the 4 of you to, there we go, for the 4 of you and whoever else joins us to ask questions as we go along. So this is kind of trying to mimic as much as I can just normal classroom environment. Okay. So the following little over an hour, we'll be discussing the settler conquest and development of North America. Right off the bat, I'm going to be talking about the lecture that's, I think, under number 3 in your questions, from the Fort Laramie treaties to the Battle of Little Bighorn. And let me just go back to the assignment material and questions just so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So you see this big question number 3 right here? What strikes you about the events that led to the Battle of Little Bighorn? What was the long-term legacy for settlers? So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to share with you a story. I could teach a whole class on this, but because of the nature of our class, I'm going to share with you 15, 20 minutes of my interpretation of the story. And remember, this ain't Sunday and I'm not a preacher, right? It's feel free to like say, hey, Rodriguez, where do you get your information about that? How do you, right? Make me prove my point, make me be persuasive in my argument and analysis. It's the same tool that lawyers use, is what us historians do. And if I keep looking down there, that's where I see your wonderful faces. So after this class, I'm going to upload this recorded Zoom lecture, and it'll be linked right to here, okay? So let's, without any further boring logistical stuff, let's get started. So this is one of those boring maps I ripped from a high school history book, I think, and it gives you a rather whitewashed interpretation of how American settlers expanded and conquered the continent. The area we're going to be focused on especially is the confluence of this area where Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota are right here. It's called the High Plains, and it was home to numerous different peoples, Lakota, Crow, and others. So we'll be looking at these. Hello, folks who've just joined us. All right. Okay. So we're going to be looking at this section right here today, the High Plains area. In 1876, the United States was celebrating. It was like a coming out party. The Philadelphia, wait, let me just ask you all, when you all see the screen, do you all see your faces on the right-hand side of the screen? You do? Okay, I'll do this. So do you want to see the faces or do you want to see the whole slide? I'll leave it up to you. Who's ever the first to, Isel, what do you think? Faces or slide?
We can see both, or at least I can.
Okay, good. I'll squeeze you over there. There you go. Yeah, I kind of like to see all the faces too. Makes me feel like I actually have a social life. Okay. So in 1876, the United States was 100 years old. It was like a coming out party. This big privately and publicly funded Philadelphia Fair was taking place. The United States was celebrating its industrial might. Within 10 years of this fair, the United States will be the #1 manufacturing country in the world, surpassing Britain and Germany. The United States was also celebrating the conquest of most native peoples, right? The conquest and removal of native peoples from their lands, and its industrial growth. This fair in Philadelphia, and why might we have chosen Philadelphia to celebrate our 100-year anniversary? What's significant about Philadelphia?
That's the place where the Constitution and Declaration were all signed, right?
Exactly. Philadelphia was the biggest, wealthiest city throughout the colonial era. New York surpassed it in the early 1800s. But Philadelphia was America's #1 city where the delegates came together to write the Constitution. It's also, Philadelphia means literally the city of brotherly love. So the fair showcased typewriters, sewing machines, telephones, all these things that US manufacturers were producing, all this new, brand new technology. Bananas were introduced to mainstream white Americans. People ate bananas before this in the Americas, but who were bananas primarily targeted? Who ate bananas in the Americas before they started to be marketed and showcased in these fairs? Who can you guess? Take a wild guess. Who? Sorry?
I would assume the people living in like Central America and the Caribbean where they grow.
Yeah, they were actually brought over from Africa and then grown in the Central America and the Caribbean, but they were actually brought over with enslaved Africans, and it was seen as slave food. So bananas were first seen as slave food, so it took a lot of marketing prowess, and Americans were good at marketing. It took a lot of marketing to have middle-class white Americans eat bananas because it was seen as like slave food and also a little too sexual. So there was all this effort, and I think in a couple of weeks I'll be sharing with you more about bananas. I'm bananas over bananas. I can show you the 3 books I have on bananas. I will let it go at that. Also in 1876, white Americans were healing after the nasty, nasty Civil War killed about 1 million Americans. So 1876, 10 years after the Civil War, white Americans, North and South, are trying to heal the wounds from this divisive war. And at the fair, they did it. 10 million people from all over the world came to Philadelphia to check out the fair and its cool little water pumps. It's a brand new hydraulic pumps and steam engines. It was just a technological marvel. Kind of like, what are those high-tech industrial showcases we have nowadays? Is it like, not Comic-Con, what's the name of it? Where different companies show off their new cool hybrid cars and things. What's it called? It's something. It was in Las Vegas last year. I see curious faces. That's just like mine. I don't know either. The fair also celebrated the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? This massive industrial undertaking to link the Pacific coast to the Mississippi River and the East Coast was celebrated. And here's one of the famous pictures at Promontory Point, Utah, in which the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific come together. However, as you'll be hearing me ask you a lot, history is a lot about what is presented, but also about what's erased from history. For example, who's missing from this picture? How's the quality of the picture, by the way? Is the quality of the picture okay? Yeah. All right, Kayla, you're very, I like how you communicate with your facial gestures, Kayla. It helps a lot. So who's missing from this picture who played a huge role in building the Transcontinental Railroad? All right, this is when I cold call people in class. This is my favorite thing to do. So Izzy, who do you think's missing from this picture about regarding who also helped build the railroad?
Would it be the slaves?
Good guess, but no, great guess. Riley, Rachel, Zoe, Nicholas, or Kayla? Who's missing?
Would it be the Asian Americans? Didn't they do a lot to build the railroad?
Bam, Rachel, you got it. So missing in that photo on purpose, they were told not to be in the photo, right? Like you kind of tell your kid brother to get out of the photo. Missing is any representation of the 20,000 Chinese who made up of, and Chinese Americans made up 90% of the Union Pacific's workforce. They're the ones who cut holes through the Sierra Nevada. So even today, when the train goes from Roseville to Nevada and crosses through the Sierras, that same tunnel was dug by Chinese Americans. This is a recent artist named Mian Situ. She reimagined the painting to look like this. And this is a more accurate image if they would have been allowed to be self-represented. So this is a cool new artist, right? How we're telling history and how we're making history changes all the time. Here's another one of her paintings, Cutting a Path in the Sierra Nevada. Powerful painting. By the way, just to give you a little historical background about the source of a very racist term, what's a racist word we use for Chinese Americans or Chinese folks in general? It's okay to say it. This is history stuff. You're not doing it in a disrespectful way. What is a disrespectful racist term for a Chinese person? It has to do with the noise making, the noise you would make trying to make a hole in a mountain. Come on, somebody guess. You can even guess in the chat if you want. We have chat options. Where's the chat? Oh, I don't see the chat. I don't see the, do y'all see the chat? Where's the chat? I don't see it. All right. What's the name for Chinese people that's very racist? Go ahead and say it. I won't not hold it against you, of course. Resize. Say it again. Yes, exactly. Chink. Oh, I had my sound down. Sorry about that. Yeah, that horrible word chink comes from the word, comes from the sound of Chinese Americans digging a hole through the Sierra Nevadas, right? Pretty horrible, right? Now you know a little bit about that. Back to the fair. So in the middle of Americans celebrating how we were just an industrial powerhouse, word came from the Midwest, I'm sorry, from the High Plains, that this guy, Civil War hero, General George Armstrong Custer, who was a Civil War hero for the United States against the Confederacy, that he and all his 7th Cavalry were killed by a group of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho natives. And it just blew many white Americans away, like, whoa, how can we be defeated? I thought we had defeated, or at least pacified, many of the Native Americans in North America. Not so. Anybody know what the name of the battle was? Not that it matters. Oh, by the way, in my classes, you'll never have to remember names and dates. That's what Wikipedia is for, right? That's what Google's for. Googlealo, right? You can always just Google it.
Isn't the battle called the Battle of Little Bighorn?
Yeah, Callan, exactly. So the Battle of Little Bighorn wasn't much of a battle. Custer and his 7th Cavalry were overwhelmingly defeated. Only 600 U.S. soldiers versus 2,500 various Plains Indian soldiers. Custer's body was also cut up, and many white Americans in the time thought this was a very dishonorable thing to do, and for many white Americans, it is a very dishonorable thing. But Native Americans, for their perspective, they thought it differently. They actually knew General Armstrong Custer was a powerful man, so that was a way in which they could share the power or release the power by cutting up his body and utilizing it. I know it's kind of hard for us to understand, but it was an honorific thing, what we would see the desecration of Custer's body. So how did this happen? So remember the question I'm asking you. This is the big question you're going to be answering. What strikes you about the events that led to the Battle of Little Bighorn? What was the long-term legacy for Indians and settlers? Well, let's go back, and I'm going to discuss why this happened. Why did 2,500 Plains Indians wipe out a U.S. cavalry? Oh, and by the way, anytime any of y'all have questions, please interrupt me. I get tired of myself speaking, right? So please interrupt me. Plus, I know like many of you, I have no social life anymore. Go ahead, Yasel, I can't hear you.
So what was the question again? The second question you're looking for?
Yeah, as we're going, going to the top, right? This is our classes modules. Come on. Right, I hope you're all familiar with this by now, right? Isel, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Okay, so does this look familiar to everybody? I hope it does. This is assignment 1. So I'm going to click on, oh, by the way, I've recently posted a Model A paper for assignment 1 from last semester, so you all have an idea about, geez, how do I get an A? Well, here's an example how you can get an A. You don't have to, of course, write like this person or the length or anything, but there's just an example about an A paper. Going back to Isel's question, I'm clicking questions and materials for assignment 1, part 1. Here are the directions. Down, 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 down. Number 3 is the big question. Does that make sense, he said? And you'll find this, yep, number 3. So let's step back. In 1851, the United States just defeated Mexico in the US-Mexican War. We were in a little bit of debt, so the United States wanted to downsize its military after this war with Mexico. And they also wanted to calm tensions between American settlers and Native Americans that was firing up on the plains and elsewhere. So the United States got together with some Sioux elders and carved out this Fort Laramie Treaty. It created the Great Sioux Reservation, which is this huge chunk of land right in current day Montana, Wyoming, Dakotas, Nebraska. Okay, 1851, boom. So what treaties are there deals between sovereign different nations about how they're going to treat one another. Okay. However, what do you think happened that got in the way of this treaty? In other words, what do you think some American settlers found in this land that they said, oh, I got to go get me some?
Probably gold.
Gold, right? Gold in them there hills, right? There was a gold rush, gold fever. In 1858, illegal settlers within the Great Sioux Reservation discovered gold, and this led to a flood of miners going into the region illegally, violating the treaty, and not to mention pissing off many Native American peoples who said, hey, wait a minute, by this treaty, you're not supposed to come in here and do this. So this led to a number of conflicts between miners and Native peoples, obviously, right? Native peoples were not going to just let this stand. So many skirmishes between Native peoples and miners and the U.S. Army occurred after this. Oh, too many words. Here, you'll see it. There we go. That's what I like to do sometimes. I posted all those words on the slide that'll be up there, and when I post this, you'll see more of the words. But what happened in 1864, oh, I'll put the slides, I'll be nice. There we go. I'll put the words, but ignore the words. So in 1864, responding to a report that some Native peoples might be attacking illegal miners, a 700 US militiamen, Colorado militiamen, went in and attacked a group of Arapaho and Cheyenne folks, mostly women and kids. The men were out on a hunting trip. They attacked them and wiped everybody out, and this has come to be known as the Sand Creek Massacre. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. So, this massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho women and children, how do you think some Americans responded to this when they heard on the telegraph, on the news? Because Americans were tuned into what was going on in the West. To many Americans, this was just first and foremost of importance. They were romanticized by it. How do you think many Americans responded to the Sand Creek Massacre? And I take guesses, right? You're not born with this knowledge.
I feel like the pattern in American history is that we do something terrible and then we justify it.
So some Americans were like, hey, we justify it through, y'all heard of the term manifest destiny? Yeah, we all justify it because we're manifest by God to destined to go all the way to Pacific Ocean, right? How do you think other Americans felt about this? Izzy or Yusel or Riley. Oh, and by the way, I'd love to have your cameras on just to see your wonderful faces, but I understand if you have connectivity issues or you don't want to, like, man, I don't want you to see my kid brother running around in the back. I get that, and that's totally fine. Totally fine. It's just selfish of me. I just like to see your faces. So how do you think some Americans responded to the Sand Creek Massacre? Some did like Joey. What do you think, Rachel, Zoe, Nicholas, or Izzy? Take a guess. Can I pick on you? Yusel, how do you think some Americans responded to this?
Sorry for the noise in the background, but I'm not sure. They're probably mad.
Yeah, some Americans, right, just like today in America. I mean, we're torn on many issues if you haven't been paying attention, right? America is kind of splitting at the seams, it seems. Don't worry, you all, sorry about that. Our generation kind of messed it up. You all will fix it, right? You next generation, you'll fix it. Thank you very much. This guy, a well-known Indian fighter, right? He was no Quaker hippie pacifist by any stretch of the imagination. Kit Carson from the South. The well-known Indian fighter, Kit Carson, commented on the Sand Creek Massacre. He was not involved in it, but he heard about it. He said, and pardon me, I'm going to pretend like I have a Southern accent. He said, just to think that of that dog Shivington and his dirty hounds. Shivington was the colonel in charge of the militia. Up there at Sand Creek, his men shot down squaws. Squaws are an American term for Native women. His men shot down squaws, blew the brains out of little innocent children. You call such soldiers Christians, do ye? And Indian savages? What do you suppose our Heavenly Father, who made both them and us, thinks of these things? I tell you what, I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do. And when they are hostile, I've fought them as hard as any man. But I never yet drew a bead on a squaw or papoose. Papoose is the name for the kid. And I despise the man who would. Interesting take, right? So even not all Indian fighters were down with massacring women and children, right? Just to counter what Joey brought in, that many Americans did justify it. And many Americans, well, how do you suppose other folks would respond to Kit Carson's commentary? That, wait a minute, didn't God create, right, both of us together? How did many Americans justify it, do you think?
Well, the sort of racial pseudoscience was pretty common at the time, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like there was kind of ideas of hierarchies being scientifically justified. I know that's a big part.
That's going to get really popular in about 10, 20 years, but you're right. The roots of it are here, Joey, for sure, right? That we are, us white folks are scientifically better, right, than brown folk, right? There's no science, by the way, for that. That is total BS made up stuff. You're right, Joey. And let's hear what Colonel Shivington had to say about it. Oops. This is what Colonel John Shivington, who headed the militia, how he responded to Kit Carson. He said, damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. And here's his mic drop. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. Don't tell my sister, but I remember when my sister had lice in elementary school and they had to cut her hair. What's a nit? What does this term mean? Nits make lice? What do you think? Izzy, can I pick on you?
I have no idea.
Okay. What do you think? Somebody else? Get Izzy's back. Get her virtual back.
Nits are like the little white, when you have lice, you have the bugs that are making you itchy, and then you have these tiny little white dots that stick to your hair, and those are essentially like egg sacs, I think. So they're the babies, essentially.
Lovely. You didn't think we'd be talking about egg sacs and lice on the first day of class, right? Welcome to the COVID world. Okay. You're right. He's basically saying we got to kill the kids because the kids are going to grow up to be warriors, right? Very nasty, genocidal way to look at things. All right, moving on. Remember, this is what events led to the Battle of Little Bighorn. So after the Civil War, too many words. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the US government once again wanted to somehow calm tensions in the plains. We wanted to downsize our military. So once again, the US government reached out to some Sioux elders and tried to hammer out a new Fort Laramie Treaty deal. And so the treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty Part 2 of 1868 was hammered out. And here, if you see, this is, where are you? General Tecumseh Sherman, who was one of the heroes of the United States against the Confederacy. And Red Cloud, the guy over here, is one of the elders of the Sioux Nation, one of the elder warriors. They are working on a treaty. Oh, by the way, a historian went and documented that this is just one of the 230 treaties the US broke with Indian nations. Not a good track record, okay? So yet another treaty made. And basically this slide shows what the treaty entails. So Indians had to, and I don't want to go over all these because you can at your leisure. I uploaded the slides. So basically, Indians had to allow whites safe travel through their lands. Whites couldn't stay on their lands, they had to travel through. They had to pay for any wrongdoing done by native peoples to whites coming through. They had to cease fighting with other native peoples, and they had to stay on the reservation. They had to stay on the res. If native peoples did these things, then the US government would protect Indians from US citizens encroaching upon their land and deliver money to them, okay? Get them, yeah, deliver monies to the folks who are behaving and staying on the reservation. Well, what do you think? If you were a native person living on the reservation, would you be down with this treaty? Would you abide?
I would have problems with the treaty. It's clearly very uneven, the power structures and the requirements on both sides.
Right? Right. Which one would you especially have trouble with specifically?
Probably paying for any wrongdoing done by their people. It's a pretty
Yep.
big group of people.
Yep. Yeah,
And white people aren't necessarily going to be nice walking and passing through, so.
yeah, and either natives aren't going to take things lying down like, oh, okay, I'm just a poor native victim. No way. Thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome.
You're right. Many native people said, oh, heck no, that treaty sucks. That's unfair. For example, Sitting Bull, famous Sioux warrior Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and thousands of Plains Indians, mostly younger warrior type men, right? These younger men, right? Frontal cortex not fully developed, want to go fight, fight, fight. It's usually the elders who are like, you know what, let's sit down and chat. So Sitting Bull, for example, Crazy Horse refused the terms of the treaty. By the way, this is not Crazy Horse. He refused to be photographed. He thought that photographs steal a little bit of your soul. So this is his kind of like his spokesman, right? His Secretary of State, little big man. So many Indians also broke the treaty guidelines. Some continued their bison hunts outside the boundaries of the designated reservation. Because do you think bison knew the boundaries of the reservation? No, not at all. There wasn't like barbed wire, there wasn't like la migra, there wasn't like boundaries, or there wasn't like a reservation wall keeping bison in whatsoever. Why are bison important to Plains Indians? In other words, what part of the bison did Native Americans use?
All of it.
All of it. For example, give me examples. I love juicy examples.
For example, they would use the hides as tents. They would use the meat as eating. They would make clothes out of them. They would use other fibers and stuff for bows and various things.
Oh yeah, they'd use the bladder, right? They didn't have water bottles, so the bladder would be a water carrier, right? You could, they would eat the adrenal glands in the buffalo's head as like a, for a spiritual kind of uplift. They get a little bit of adrenaline in a way, not as a recreational, but more in a ritualistic way. So 1868, Fort Laramie Treaty Part 2. Oh my gosh, what's gonna be discovered there again that ruins this treaty once again? Say it.
Gold.
Gold. Thank you. Then more gold discovered in 1874. Boom, 1874, Custer and his cavalry rolled into the Black Hills to protect illegal miners from natives who were like upset that this is happening again, right? Seems like just a repeat of history to many natives. General Custer's commander ordered him back, but he refused and he went in, and we know what happens then, the Battle of Little Bighorn, okay? Custer and his 600 US soldier and his Crow allies were defeated. The legacy of this, what's the legacy of the Battle of Little Bighorn and the killing of all of the 7th Cavalry and the Civil War hero Custer? Excuse me. Well, the United States government decided to re-expand our military. Remember, after the Civil War, the United States shrunk it down in order to save money. As has happened for every war in US history, except after World War II. We're gonna see how during World War II, we kept the military at a very warlike pace as far as spending goes, and we'll talk about that in assignment 3. So the legacy of the Battle of Little Bighorn is the expansion of the US military to finally put down any Native American rebellions. And as Callan listened to, I started off this lecture at 12:30 with the discussion of buffalo soldiers. And have you all heard of buffalo soldiers? Are they out there in like movies or pop culture or anything? I really am curious. Yeah? No, buffalo soldiers not? I don't know. There you go. So that's an example of one of my lectures discussing this. Are you all gonna ace this number 3? Do you feel confident about acing it? Do you have any questions or comments, or do you want me to move on to number 4?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am, you better ask a question. It makes me feel, I don't know, like I'm doing my job or something.
This isn't, I don't know, it's kind of a detail and more or less big picture, but you had talked about various people's responses to the Sand Creek massacre.
Yep.
Do we know what Custard thought of the Sand Creek massacre? Like, does he have a statement on that that's known?
I don't know an exact statement. I'm sure he did, but I bet you anything he was on the side of, you know what, we have to pacify the natives. So Custer on one hand, let's go look at Custer. Whoops. Custer had a reputation for being very brave, from leading from the front, and this came during the Civil War, right? Leading from the front, even oftentimes without the okay of his commanders in the Civil War and in the Indian Wars. I'm calling it Indian Wars, the wars in which the US forces conquered and pacified Native peoples, from Modoc County all the way to the Plains Indians. So my guess is, my educated guess is he supported maybe not 100% what John Chivington said, but in essence, he would support, you know what, we just have to get rid of them because their time has passed. The time for American expansion is with us. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
That totally does.
Okay. Oh, I didn't even share with you my things. Okay.
I have a quick question too.
Yes, ma'am. And how do I say your name?
Izzy.
Izzy, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so these questions that we're looking at, we're answering them and then we submit them. Is that how it works? Is there like a specific time we submit them, or?
Ooh, good question. Izzy, I'm not picking on you, but I think you missed last week's office stuff, which is fine. Because
I did miss last week's, yeah.
That's all right. So check it out. Here are the questions. Okay.
Okay, yeah,
And these are
I'm
the-
on that page, so I saw
And
that.
then right below that is submit.
All right.
And again, you know what I'm offering? You all can submit it in traditional word sentences, but you can also submit it in a podcast form. You could submit it as a video. I'm open to any of that. I think that would be really cool, because don't we have different ways in which we express ourselves? Right? Yes. So does that answer your question, Izzy?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, there it is, submit. And here's the different ways you could submit. All right. Okay, let's go back to questions and materials. Let me just hit you all up. What happened to the bison in North America? Does anybody know? There used to be millions.
They were all killed off because the Native Americans were relying on them as a food source. So
Yeah, so why kill them off? Do we just not like Native Americans eating bison ribs? Oh, bison ribs. Why kill them off? I know it's obvious. You're like, Rodriguez, we know. Why kill off the bison then?
it's the same reason why, like, if you, in modern America, if you burned all of our cornfields, we'd have a problem because that's a lot of what we eat. And so they got rid of all the bison because that's the majority of their diet, essentially.
Yeah, could you imagine if they got rid of the Winco and the Walmart? Oh, man. And
Well, I mean,
NFL football? No, I hear you. No, you're right. If they got rid of all the cornfields. And you're absolutely right. The number one way Americans get, let me move this over here. The number one way Americans get calories is through corn. And it's actually, you know what form corn we take in? The number one caloric source for Americans?
syrup.
Corn syrup. Isn't that crazy? Corn syrup. And this started in like the post-NAFTA, early 1990s. Okay. So there were two big questions facing Americans in the 1900s. I'm sorry, the 1800s, which we also call the 19th century, which still confuses me. So one of the big questions of the 19th century was, what do we do with the 5 million enslaved people and growing number of free blacks? We'll deal with that next time. Another big question Americans were facing with, what do we do with native peoples and their lands, because we want them out and we want their land. Okay, big, big issues, front and center issues in America during this time. So, as Joey said, Joey, am I pronouncing your name right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, and again, if you all want to be called something else besides your government or besides what your name shows on the Zoom, let me know, okay? So the US decided a policy that it was more humane to kill off the buffalo than to just straight up kill off Native Americans. I don't know that the humanity of that is debatable, but this was the case. General
Did
Sheridan.
they ever use? Oh,
I'm sorry?
sorry, Rachel. Did they ever use any alternate justifications for killing off the buffalo, or did they just kind of do it?
Here is a photograph. Here is a very famous painting, a painting that I will show you numerous times. So this is a long way to answer your question, Rachel. Sorry about that. I like
It's
long.
fine.
So what's going on in this painting? You all check it out and help me out.
Oh,
What's going on in this painting? Here is, so you all are amateur historians. And if anybody ever calls you amateur, say thank you. Because amateur comes from the Latin word amar, which means to what? What does amar mean in Spanish or in Latin? Amar? A-M-A-R?
To love.
To love, right? So next time somebody calls you an amateur, say, oh, thank you. Because you love what you do, but you don't get paid. All right. So as amateur historians, how do you analyze this photo? What's going on?
This looks like an angel or some angelic being moving across, and it looks like the dark is being split, kind of as settlers move. So I would presume manifest destiny.
Right. Yep. Good, good, good. What else? I like details. I'm not going to step on what you said, Rachel. I want other folks to chime in, then I'll chime in.
So, you could see like all the natives going into the dark, and they're just really, I don't know, going to a bad place, and the settlers are moving them out.
Yeah, culturally, don't we see dark as bad? Like culturally, we see dark as like scary and bad, right? And then light, ooh, right, here comes the light over here. And this is an allegory of the United States. Her name is Columbia, after Christopher Columbus. Here she is floating across the plains. And do you see what's in her hand? What is she stringing across the plains?
oh, the wires. I thought it was a lasso, but
Yeah, no. Woo, woo, woo. Oh, rodeo queen Columbia. I like it. No, but it's actually, she's stringing a telegraph wire made out of copper across the plains to signify the wonderful development that Americans are going to bring. But you're right, Isel, over here are Native Americans being chased away. And do you see who's with Native Americans here? What's that shape? I don't know how well you all can see it. You see that thing right there? What is that?
Buffalo?
Yeah, it's a bison. Bison. Call it buffalo, bison, it doesn't matter. Bison's technically the correct term, but I don't care. So you're right. So Native Americans are being chased out. Here comes miners. Here are gold miners. Here are settlers, right, with their cattle. Their cattle are yoked. Yoked is how they connect the cattle. And the old ways are being swept away to bring about new modern technology with railroads and dams and bridges. So Rachel, this is a long-winded way of saying one of the ways in which Americans justified, the extermination, removal of not only Native Americans, but bisons, is because it was just meant to be. Aren't we making this a better place? Does that make sense, Rachel?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. Oh, I miss class. How many of you all like online better than class? Yeah? Okay. I miss class. All right, I'll say it. I got it off my chest. A little dispatchal. So what many companies did is they reached out to folks and they said, hey, we will offer you a hunting excursion. You didn't even know how to ride. You didn't even know how, you did not have to know how to ride a horse. For example, if you're a rich Philadelphia lawyer and wanted to go to this romantic West and shoot yourself some bison, you can do so from the comfort of the railroad car, right? And just shoot the bison out the window, right? And other folks would, if you want the hide or the head, other folks would skin it or scalp it, whatever you wanted. You could take it home with you after they tanned it and what have you. So this is one of the ways in which the bison population went from 65 million to, in the late 1800s, less than 1,000. That's incredible. And many of those less than 1,000 were in zoos, right? They were in zoos like in Brooklyn. They were in zoos like in Buffalo, New York, and Cleveland. Isn't that crazy? Just think of the smell on top of the heap of bison skulls. Nasty. And this is the rationale that General Sheridan gave to this policy. He said, bison hunters have done more in the last 2 years and will do more in the next year to settle the vexed Indian question than the entire regular army has done in the last 40 years. They're destroying the Indians' commissary. In other words, they're destroying the Indians' store. It is a well-known fact that an army losing its base of supplies is placed at a great disadvantage. For a lasting peace, let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffaloes are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle. Yeah. There you go. Questions or comments about that? Oh, by the way, big invention. Talk about inventions at the right time in the right place. Some guy named Joseph Glidden came up with the idea of twisting sharpened pieces of metal together. Because remember, America was an growing industrial giant at this time, producing a lot of iron and pretty soon steel. And now you could have barbed wire fencing in the land, your private property, and fencing in your domesticated cattle. If any of you are ever in Nebraska on a road trip, go to the barbed wire museum. Send me a postcard, extra credit, okay? I've offered this to hundreds of my students the last few years. I've yet to receive a postcard. I'm sad, so go to the barbed wire museum in wonderful Nebraska. I've never been.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Who's speaking? Go ahead. You said.
So the spread of the cattle kingdom, is that referring to the settlers?
Yeah, okay. If you, oh yeah, check this out. Why do I put the cattle kingdom in quotes? Right, Isel, you're wondering? Watch this. Are y'all watching? Magic. So if you click on those links to the text, here's the textbook for this class. It's free. And if you scroll down, the cattle kingdom. So that's what it's referring to. Does that make sense? So those of you who want to get an A or a B in class, make sure you include information from the lectures and the textbook. And if there's a podcast or so, include information from all the sources in your answer. And that'll make me smile when I'm grading your paper, and you want me to smile when when I'm grading. All right, does that make sense, he said? And let me show you another cool thing. If you hit this search bar here, and if you just go Cattle Kingdom, where the heck is it in the book, Rodriguez? I don't know. Oh, no results? Oh, that's a bad example, Rodriguez. Did I spell Cattle Kingdom wrong? Well, that's not good. It should have showed Cattle Kingdom. Oh, my bad. All right. You know what? Let me show you an example that will work. You have to find things about the Sand Creek Massacre. There it is. In 17.4. So what I'm doing is showing you a way in which it'll make your life easier if you're looking for information about the questions I ask you. Here is the write-up of the Sand Creek Massacre, okay? The thing I lectured about briefly. All righty, so is that a long-winded way of answering your question? Okay. So we have about 10 more minutes. I'll go till 1:30, and then I'll stick around for a bit if any of y'all have any specific questions. But I'm going to offer you one more example. I'm going to offer you one more thing. So let's go back to the questions. Here we go. So you see this question number 8 about the Mount Rushmore? Oh, you're not seeing it because I'm not sharing my screen, huh? Share screen, sorry about this. Going. So do you see the Mount Rushmore question number 8? Yeah, Izzy, thank you. Let me talk a little bit about this. So remember, well, in addition to what are we going to do with African Americans, what are we going to do with Native American people and their, what are we going to do with all the Western land the United States was acquiring through conquest and through victories and wars against Mexico, for example? Well, on one hand, especially by the late early 1900s, there began to develop a conservation movement, and we'll get into this a little more in assignment 2. Here's President Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s on the left with conservationist John Muir on the right, and in the background, where's that background image of? Anybody know where that is?
Is that Yosemite?
Yosemite, yep, Yosemite. Yosemite, in Miwok it means land of the gaping mouth. So Yosemite was one of the first national parks created by the federal government. In fact, President Lincoln, after the war, was going to go and hang out and sort of recoup after the Civil War. He and his wife were going to go out there. But what happened to President Lincoln? Why could he never go and visit Yosemite?
Died.
Huh?
He was assassinated.
Yeah, a Confederate sympathizer went and shot him in the head. Jeez, not cool. Yellowstone was another park set aside, quote, set aside for a pleasure ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. However, and this is important, I think, which people could enjoy and benefit from Yellowstone, for example? Which Americans?
The white ones.
Yeah, which ones couldn't? Which ones got kicked out?
The natives who are now imprisoned on a reservation.
Yep. So laws went into place. Now, if you hunted without a license or a permit, that would be called poaching, and you could be fined. And this was largely targeted towards Native Americans who continued their traditional bison hunts and hunting and gathering. And in fact, even Native American ceremonies were not allowed. Okay, so Native Americans couldn't hold their religious ceremonies, couldn't live or hunt on the national park land. And here is an example of the Indian Religious Crimes Code in 1882. The US Congress passed and the president signed this code, which said, there's no good reason why an Indian should be permitted to indulge in practices which are repugnant to common decency and morality. The preservation of good order on the reservations demands that some active measures should be taken to discourage and put a stop to the demoralizing influence of heathenist rites. That just means their religious practices that aren't Christian. Isn't that messed up? Yeah.
Is this the point in when they started bringing Native children to like the boarding schools where they teach them white
Yeah.
culture?
I'm going to lecture. That's going to be part of. That's going to be part of assignment 1. Whose American Dream? Assignment 1, part 3. Right here. I'm going to click it. Doink. Here's where I'm going to be dealing with that issues. Native American survival and resilience in the face of settler invasion. So yes, Joey, you're exactly right. This is a time when Native American kids were kidnapped or brought to boarding schools to teach them how to be Americans. You're exactly right, Joey. Oh, by the way, this law was repealed in 1978, so all is good, right?
It's too recent. It's just insanely too recent.
Oh, recent, I know. All right. Because many, including John Muir, envisioned national parks to be open to a place where you can go become at one with nature. You've seen all those REI ads and everything. You can go drive your Jeep to the top of a mountain and pretend you're all alone. So Yosemite National Park was open to vacationers, right, but not to Native peoples there. Another thing that happened as in the heart of the Black Hills, this is on the Sioux Reservation that was promised to them through the Fort Laramie Treaty. You know what the Six Grandfathers Mountain was transformed to?
Mount Rushmore.
Say it again?
Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. So check that. Isn't that so freaking symbolic power move? Not even a total power move. So this thing called the Six Grandfathers Mountain for the Sioux, this is, they envision their 6 grandfathers, was dynamited and turned into Mount Rushmore. What do you think of that? Isn't that crazy? It's a wonderful piece of art, Mount Rushmore. I take that.
There's something like horrifyingly poetic about, because I knew that like it was a sacred Native American mountain that they carved American figures into, but there's something extra gross about like it's the 6 grandfathers and then they carved 4 of a different country's founding fathers. I don't know if I'm making sense, but the language of it is like almost poetic in a really terrifying way that I don't like.
What do you think, Rachel, Nicolas, Issy, Isel, or whoever else is on? What's your takes on that?
I think it was probably an intentional move since it was like the 6 grandfathers to put founding fathers up there. definitely like a power move, and like this is ours now. It's ours.
Total power move. Yep. I agree. Like when my dog sits on other dogs. Power move. All right. So that's the question for the 6 grandfathers mountain to Mount Rushmore. Again, I want to emphasize that if you want to answer the question, in the way that's not the traditional 3 to 5 sentences, if you want to offer a piece of art or a spoken word or a podcast or anything, I totally welcome that, because it makes it kind of cool and interesting for me as well, because I know there's various ways of, expressing reality. For example, one of my students wrote this poem about Mount Rushmore. This mountain, once sacred to you, will now adopt our pale hue. As we pound and scrape the 6 grandfathers' legacy, you will be brought to your knees. And above the rubble that covers the trees, the 4 men stare and command thee. Join us now, savage men. You may be born again. Save yourself a lifetime of pain. We are here. We will stay. There is no point in throwing your life away. We are inevitable. That is what we say. Now, shoot your last arrow and dress like us, with a mind like us, and leave your cave. Yeah, I was just a student like you all last semester. Isn't that powerful? All right, I want to respect your time, but as you'll notice, I didn't lecture about all the issues discussed in assignment 1, part 1. What I'm going to do is record those lectures on my own and upload them to the questions. Let me show you. Upload them right onto the questions and material aspect part of thing, right here. Modules. Right there. Okay. For example, I did not lecture about Western mining, okay? But I really think it's interesting, and I do have that as part of my lectures. Isn't it crazy that early mining camps were 90% men? How might this mining camp, I don't know, sound, smell, or feel if you have 90% of men out there looking for gold and trying to mine? Isel or Nicholas or Izzy or Rachel, can I pick on you? How do you envision this mining camp with such a population?
Would smell nasty.
Oh man, could you imagine? Smell nasty. You think there was booze involved? Oh my gosh. So in America, you all might think Americans have a drinking problem. But we only drink 2.35 gallons a year, like of 90% stuff. This is how they measure it, right? And that's for every man, woman, and child in the United States, right? Some folks don't drink, some folks drink a lot. This is the average. Check this out. In mining towns, the average was 16 gallons a year per person. Whoa, so they drank 8 times more. It's incredible. So people were getting like cirrhosis of the liver, they were fighting, they were all those bad things that come with drinking.
To be fair, they probably didn't have a ton of clean water easily available.
Yeah, that's another issue. Clean water was not normal. It was not common. People oftentimes took water from the stream, but the stream was also sewage, right? There was no sanitary systems. Yeah, nasty, I know. So there was a clean water issue for sure. And most American farmers who grew grain, found they would get more money if they turned their grain into booze because it wouldn't go bad. Grain can only last for so long before the rats eat it or it spoils. So how do you make good, quick money on your grain? You ferment it and turn it into whiskey. So I'll be talking about prostitution and how that was widespread in the mining towns and elsewhere. And I'm just giving you examples of the lectures I'm going to upload that aren't going to be live. Okay. All right. So does anybody have any questions now? Because I did say I was just going to go till 1:30, but I'm happy to stay on. Any questions about any old thing, logistic wise or material content wise? Are you saying something, Cell? I can't hear you. No? Okay. All right. So I'm going to end the recording of this right now, but I'm going to stay on and harass you more for